Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was a drug dealer, sure. But what most people don't realize is that he ran his operation almost exactly like a global company. He was overseeing product lines, supply chains, logistics networks, regional managers, international expansion, risk management, and even his own kind of R&D to develop newer, more profitable drugs. At his US trial, prosecutors pushed to take more than $12 billion in drug money from him. That number alone gives you a rough idea of the size of this business. So in this video, we're not doing the typical true crime gore rundown. Instead, we're going to treat El Chapo's cartel like a multinational corporation. How did he build it from the ground up? How did it actually function on a business level, day to day? And how did this giant, efficient money machine finally meet its end? The origins. Before we get into the big cartel machine, we need to look at the prototype of his business, the place that trained him. El Chapo grew up in Sinaloa, in the Golden Triangle, where Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua meet. Poor, rural, and full of marijuana and opium poppy fields. In other words, he essentially grew up inside a small, informal supply chain. You plant, you tend, you harvest, and someone higher up the chain comes to buy the product. His education was watching who paid, who got rich, and who ended up dead. That's when you start to see his main skill. Understanding how the system worked, then looking for leverage inside it. This is what later lets him go from a mere driver to something much closer to CEO. We'll get to that later though. For now, we can turn this into a full biography and follow every step of his personal story. But again, this isn't a documentary on Guzmán as a person. From this point forward, we're going to focus only on how his business actually worked. In the 1980s, the Guadalajara cartel, led by Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, dominated the Mexican side. Then the US cracked down on the Colombian sea route into Florida. The Colombians needed a new way in. Mexico had a long, porous border, so they hired Mexican groups as transport partners. The Guadalajara cartel basically became their shipping company. El Chapo was inside that system, working in places like Sinaloa and Jalisco. He handled transport, organized loads, and learned how a large cartel structured its different moving parts. In 1989, Felix Gallardo was arrested, but before going away, he reportedly helped divide up territories among his old lieutenants. Different groups got different border corridors, and Sinaloa went to a group that included El Chapo. Guzmán now has his own route, his own people, and his own responsibilities. But he's still, technically, a service provider or the driver. So, instead of asking to be paid in cash for moving Colombian cocaine, El Chapo starts asking to be paid in product. The logic is simple. If you get paid in cash, you're just a transporter. If you get paid in product, now you own inventory. With inventory, you can do your own deals, set your own prices, and build your own downstream distribution. That turned his operation into a real company and him into a CEO. Now we can start at the bottom of his company and work our way up. Products and business model. At first, the main products were plant-based, marijuana, Colombian cocaine, and later heroin produced from opium poppies in Mexico. But as time went on, law enforcement in the US and Canada cracked down on local meth labs. Mexican cartels saw this opening, and El Chapo's people moved quickly. They began importing chemical precursors, often from abroad, and cooking them in large labs across Mexico. Some of these labs were disguised as legitimate facilities, things like chemical or cosmetic plants on paper, so they could blend into industrial areas and avoid suspicion from authorities driving past. The margins were ridiculous. Producing a kilo of meth in Mexico could cost just a few $100s. Once that kilo was broken down and sold in the US, it could be worth tens of thousands of dollars. Compared to growing and moving huge fields of marijuana, running labs that could operate year-round and didn't depend on seasons or weather was simply more efficient and more profitable. Over time, the Sinaloa cartel expanded its portfolio, It still dealt in plant-based drugs like marijuana, heroin, and cocaine, but it leaned more and more into synthetic drugs like meth. Later, especially under El Chapo's sons, the Chapitos, the organization pushed deeper into synthetic opioids like fentanyl, which are incredibly potent in tiny amounts. The idea here is simple. He built a diversified product line. If one product's profit dipped or became harder to move, others could carry the revenue. The next step is to move all this product. Vertical integration. Logistics was El Chapo's real superpower. His team used almost every method you can think of to move drugs. They hid loads in secret compartments in cars and trucks, mixed them into legitimate cargo like fruit and vegetables, stuffed cocaine into cans of jalapenos under fake brands, slipped shipments onto trains, flew smaller loads over the border in ultralight aircraft, and even pushed drugs on semi-submersible vessels that skimmed just below the ocean surface. He also invested heavily in the transport chain. His operation used planes with loyal pilots, trucks with trusted drivers, maritime vessels with captains on the payroll, and warehouses near border crossings to store and repack product. By controlling as much of that chain as possible, he cut out the middlemen, reducing the risk of betrayal, and gained more control over timing. On top of all that, he used tunnels. Yeah, we are not talking about some crude holes in the ground. They were engineered projects with ventilation, lighting, and sometimes rail systems for carts. Some tunnels ran from warehouses in Mexico directly to warehouses in the US. From a pure business perspective, this was genius. The border itself is the biggest bottleneck and the riskiest point. If you can bypass or soften that, you cut risk and can move much larger, more profitable loads at once. However, there's one tunnel in this story that wasn't built for drugs at all. We'll come back to that. For now, let's move toward the final piece in our puzzle. How did he manage to actually run this whole thing? Management style and corporate structure. El Chapo wasn't completely alone. The Sinaloa cartel also had other key leaders, like Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and later, El Chapo's own sons. Under that top layer, the structure looked a lot like an illegal version of a corporate org chart. There were regional bosses who controlled specific states in Mexico or particular border crossings. Below them were operational managers who oversaw transport, tunnels, labs, and warehouses in their areas. To move the cash, they hired financial specialists who leveraged front companies in areas like agriculture, transport, and import-export. Cash from the sales would be broken up, smuggled back into Mexico, or wired through different accounts. Sometimes they even used trade-based laundering, buying goods in the United States, shipping them into Mexico, and then selling them to convert dirty dollars into pesos that appeared legitimate on paper. El Chapo himself had a very hands-on management style. He truly understood how fast the product should move, which routes were performing, and how much money certain regions were supposed to generate. If you made him money and stayed loyal, you were rewarded and protected. If you caused problems or were suspected of betrayal, you were in serious danger. No matter how good the structure looks, this is still an illegal business. So, how do you protect it? Risk management and the cost of doing business. First, corruption was treated like a non-negotiable expense. The cartel poured money into bribing local police, customs officers, politicians, and, in some cases, high-ranking officials. Then, there was compartmentalization. The organization was divided into cells. A driver might know who gave him the load and who was supposed to receive it at the other end, but he wouldn't know much else. A regional manager might understand his own routes and his boss above him, but not have a full picture of leadership in other states or other countries. This design meant that when one part of the network was exposed or arrested, it couldn't automatically take everyone else down with it. On top of all that, there was enforcement inside the organization and in the territories they controlled. In a legal business, bad performance or betrayal might get you fired or sued. In the narco world, eliminating competition or punishing disloyalty often meant violence. The phrase plata o plomo summed it up. Silver or lead. Take the bribe or take the bullet. That applied to officials, local power brokers, and sometimes people in communities who tried to resist or step away. For a long time, it looked like the Sinaloa cartel, and El Chapo in particular, could not be stopped. But every business model has weak points. Why the empire started to fall apart. The more famous El Chapo became, the more the walls closed in. Arrested in 1993, escaped in 2001, caught again in 2014, escaped again through a tunnel under his shower in 2015. Yes, this is the one we mentioned earlier. Anyway, recaptured in 2016 and shipped to the US in 2017. Every escape added to his myth, but it also triggered more international attention and resources focused on taking him down. When law enforcement finally closed in, key insiders, including high-level traffickers and US-based distributors, flipped. In court, they walked prosecutors step by step through his routes, his tunnels, his money flow. While he was hiding or locked up, the inside of Sinaloa also started to shake. His sons, old allies, and rivals like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel all pushed for more power. Less unity meant more gunfights, more headlines, and a sloppier operation. The final nail in the coffin? Legal weed in several US states made smuggled marijuana less valuable. The opioid crisis pushed demand toward heroin and then fentanyl. Fentanyl was insanely profitable, but it lit up every radar. Governments started tracking chemicals, raiding labs, and tearing into the money networks behind synthetics. In 2019, the loop closed for good. El Chapo was sentenced to life, plus 30 years in a US prison, and ordered to forfeit all his money in drug proceeds. If you want more videos like this, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment. Which part of his business strategy actually shocked you the most?